Hello, and thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Kaylia Garrido, and I head up digital strategy and marketing here at Great Data Minds. Before we get into our exciting conversation today, just a little bit more about Great Data Minds. We are a new breed of data collaborative. We're passionate data activists, and we have a staggering amount of experience among our advisors and our resources. Also, our special guest stars like we have today. We offer advisory services and solutions around data management, data ops, self-service, analytics, agile program management, and we never forget about the humans, so we focus on data literacy and transformation workshops as well. We also produce great content in the way of podcasts, blog posts, videos, live events, and like today, webinars and online events. So if you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, please do. This is how you keep abreast of all the cool stuff that we have going on, and you can always find us at greatdataminds.com. Now, for today's talk, the good stuff. We are going to talk about how data affects the world of diversity and inclusion, and I am so proud to introduce the esteemed Elaine Marino as our subject matter expert. Elaine is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion Strategy at Charles Schwab. She is also the founder of Equally, which is a diversity and inclusion powerhouse that is on a mission to build a stronger, more diverse tech community that will level the playing field for underrepresented or underutilized groups in technology. Elaine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kaylia, for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I am excited too. I have heard you speak about this topic a few different times, maybe not specifically around data, but I know that you are absolutely the brain trust when it comes to this kind of thing. And I'm so excited for you to share some of that with our audience today.
Me as well. I have to first say that everything I share is not about Charles Schwab. I'm actually not allowed to speak on their behalf. So this will be really just my subject matter expertise and really coming from a place of all the clients I've worked with, especially while working with Equally. So just wanted to get that disclaimer out there.
Duly noted. Thank you. Okay. All right. Well, let's just start right at the beginning. Can you share a bit about the current state of the diversity and inclusion world?
Absolutely. It is a hot topic. And I don't know if it's just because, what do you call it? Like Google Analytics knows that I'm a subject matter expert, so they're just feeding me the stories, but I think it's actually a pretty hot topic. I see it in the sports world pretty extensively. NFL, Major League Baseball have both had some very large, high profile sort of mishaps around diversity and inclusion that have forced them to either make some systemic changes or not, but definitely topics of conversation. I remember this past World Series, my friend was like, the Houston Astros need to hire you. Like, seriously, just call them. But then in the world of business as well, and also media, right? And Hollywood and tech, I think tech actually led the charge in terms of, the really high profile cases of Uber and Facebook and things that have just gone awry in the tech world. But I feel like no industry is immune. I think that there are some systemic aspects to both corporate America as well as just our society, and it's all bubbling to the top. And so I would say the current state is that there is a real heightened awareness. Leadership is aware that it affects their bottom line, that it affects innovation, it affects their ability to recruit and retain talent. And I think some of the driving forces behind that are shifting demographics in the country and world at large, and also just shifting expectations. The younger generation, and I say younger, but really millennials and especially Gen Z, have the expectation of inclusion. And it's such an expectation, it's such a part of their moral fiber that it's not even that they ask for it, they just assume it'll be there. And if it's not there, then they actually get quite upset and they either change jobs or they complain or they file lawsuits or they speak up. Wow. And so there's a real shift in mindset around inclusion.
Wow. I mean, things are certainly changing. I feel the earth moving under me when it comes to this. And I mean, it's very good, but it's a big change from the way that things were run in the past. And we'll talk a little bit about generational differences as we continue our conversation. But when we look at things from a data perspective, so how would you say that data affects the world of diversity and inclusion? How do you track progress on diversity and inclusion with data?
Yeah, so many things. So you have to know your numbers. You have to know the makeup of your organization. So let's just take this from a business perspective. You can't fix what you don't know, and you can't fix what you can't measure. So I would say that data is actually just a foundational part of diversity and inclusion. And there are a couple different things to measure. First of all, there's just straight up, what does your workforce look like? You know, what is your gender split? And let me back up and just say what diversity and inclusion is really about underrepresented groups. We don't really say minority because women are not a minority, right? They make up 51% of the population, but they will be underrepresented. You see that a lot in boardrooms, right? There'll be 0 women. That's an underrepresentation compared to, gosh, not just the population, but the capabilities of women, right? There have been many women who have gotten their PhDs and sat on boards that aren't on all of those boards. So underrepresented, and we're looking at different categories of underrepresentation, and these categories are based off of protected classes. These are things that the United States government have deemed, groups that the United States government have deemed necessary classes to be protected because otherwise they are at a disadvantage. So women are one of them.
Okay.
People of color, racial and ethnic minorities make up that population, as well as veterans and people with disabilities. The LGBTQ community also is protected in the same way that women are protected under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but measured a little differently. It depends really if an organization wants to measure the LGBTQ community. So that's sort of how you look at diversity. So what I would say to organizations is you have to actually look at the makeup of all of that. And if you've never asked, because it is optional, it always should be optional to ask, to just get a baseline. What does your organization look like and where are there gaps? And you can do 2 things. You can then measure against population, measure against available talent pool, measure against your industry. And that just gives you a really nice baseline to understand where your gaps are, in your realistic gaps. Now, what tends to happen with all data is that people go down the rabbit hole. You're starting to count, you know, in minutia, right? You're saying, I need to hire 5 more women this year to make it. You got to be careful, right? I actually want to really suggest that if you're a smaller organization, to keep that data super private and potentially not ask. I would make N equal at a minimum 5, but really you want to get to a place where you're not able to singly identify someone as you're looking at the data. And unfortunately, there is such an underrepresentation, especially I will say like in tech for the Black community, you're talking such small numbers that you can identify individuals. And that's something we want to stay away from. So I would say, look at larger percentages, just so you can get a baseline and you can see areas where you need to develop talent, where you need to recruit talent. And then I separate out, there's diversity data, which is kind of what I just talked about, the makeup of your organization. And then there's inclusion data. And inclusion data includes your rate of attrition, your rate of promotion, your rate of development. So for instance, you can look and see by levels, right? Who's in your senior management, who is in your middle management, and who are individual contributors by demographics. I think it's really important to cut that data by demographics. And then you can start to see which groups are not moving up, who is coming in the door, and who is never making it to the top. One study that I think is really important people look at is McKinsey does the, it's in partnership with Lean In. And it's the women, it's a very large women's study, and we can link to it, I think, on this. And what's really fascinating is it's very visually shows you that women will come in at 51%, and then they slowly start to not make it to the top. And then they also cut that by race and ethnicity, which is also really important to see just how few women of color make it as well.
So that's a really interesting point though, Elaine, because what you just mentioned, women come in the door, maybe then it's a revolving door, or they get promoted, but only so far. And then, you know, kind of those levels don't stay equal as we go through. So, I mean, people's stories are so complex, right? Like, can we trust that data? Like, I mean, social norms and biases kind of abound in this sort of world. So how do we get our arms around that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's 2 parts to this, right? So the data will indicate where you have gaps and where you should go, but I wouldn't rely too heavily on it. What I would also look at are there systems and processes and frankly, people in place that are basically causing that data to look that way, right? So for instance, if 51% of your initial hiring are women, and let's say 30% of your initial hiring are people of color, and then at that next level, it cuts in half, right? All of a sudden you have 25% female managers and 15% people of color managers, and then nobody ever really makes it to the C level. You have to think, well, did they choose that? A lot of old school thinking was, well, they went off and had kids, right? Yeah. And we all know, and I know you can definitely speak to this, that that's not really the case, right? Yes, sure, they had babies, but most people are a 2-income household and they need that income, and women strive and want to work. Mm-hmm. So something else is holding them back. And a lot of times it's the system. The system has been built for men who don't have to take leave of absences, yeah, for men to not have gaps in their careers, for men who can have stay-at-home wives, right? Stay-at-home spouses, I should say. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden, those that are most productive are because the system is built for them. I'll give a perfect example. Maternity leave, leaves of absences can really, really impact a woman's ability to get promoted and stay in the game, right? So is it beyond the realm of possibility for an organization to level that out, to say, you know what, it's truly just part of business as usual to be on maternity leave, and right, she will not be penalized. She will still get her bonus. She will still be eligible for promotion, even if she leaves to have a baby and come back, right? Yeah. That's an idea of the system. So when you're looking at the data, it's not simply, we need to recruit more students, Latino students. Mm-hmm. It truly is what factors into their lives that's different than what we already have the system set up for. So that's really what the data is indicating for. And then there's just straight up manager training, right? Mm-hmm. Lots of people don't know how to manage, first of all, but they certainly don't know how to manage people who are not like themselves, right? If you are a white woman and you are a manager of a lot of people like yourself, and then you have maybe, a woman who is of color and also identifies as a lesbian, and you have no ability to connect with her or understand her needs, mm-hmm, she's always going to feel othered. And you as a manager have to learn how to create that inclusive environment. So that's the other part of it. That's the human side of it, right? Yeah. What can you do as an individual manager to make sure you're creating an inclusive environment?
Wow. Okay. So when we talk, all right, so this is a great segue into what you started to talk about initially around the different generations and how this comes into play as well. So when people are having to sort of learn how to relate to or talk to or, work with somebody that they're not familiar with, maybe that, all the different things that person carries with them. Yeah. How does the 4 different generations that we currently have in the workforce come into play here?
Absolutely. Oh gosh, there's so many things to say here. Each generation is highly different for a few factors. One is technology. You have a younger generation that for the first time ever experienced things that an older generation has never experienced. And everyone's expectations are set differently because they've experienced that technology and that rapidness. There are also things that happened during the younger generation's lives that did not happen during the older generation's lives, like 9/11, right? They were mostly children when that happened. Like the stock market crash, right? The 2008, 2010 recession was much larger than anything experienced, frankly, by almost anyone alive. Few people were alive in this day and age in 1929, right? So they have this sort of just different and very large life experiences that makes them different. So how do you cross-generation that? Well, I think first of all, people have to be willing to get out of their comfort zone. Mm-hmm. They have to be willing to say, you know what, we all have the same needs, right? We all want to be managed well. We all want to be recognized for our hard work. We all want to promote. We all want to do great work. Now, the way of getting to that great work will be different, right? And certain technologies and certain processes will be uncomfortable for all. And so it's really just recognizing that you have to have the conversation. So it really goes back to the inclusive environment. Anyone that's listening, I highly, highly recommend learning about being an inclusive leader. There are 6 signature traits to being an inclusive leader. This comes from Deloitte, Australia. And those 6 signature traits are something that are universal, right? These are human needs that are being met, and they're cross-generational. Yeah. And if you can be and practice those six traits really well, you will create an environment no matter what age anyone on your team is, which generation on your team, because you will be curious about them. You will be cognizant of your own bias. You will have courage to ask the hard questions. Those are 3 of them. I'm trying to remember the other 3 off the top of my head, but you get the point, which is, it's the difference between making an assumption about someone because they're younger or older, and instead having an interpersonal conversation, a one-on-one with someone.
Yeah. I feel like this is so interesting, especially in the world that we live in today. I feel like some of this stuff should just be so second nature. Like the fact that we are human beings talking to each other should stand before everything else. But at the same time, with the way that the world is and where we are with reality, I think this is a great conversation to have. Like, these traits can help not only if you're trying to be an inclusive leader, but just everybody, right? We all seem to draw lines in the sand these days of where we stand on certain issues or in politics and things like this. And, this kind of basic human decency tendencies, I think, should just be like, it would be great if everybody led with that. But if they don't, then I think it's really, you're giving out some really good resources that people can look at to get themselves there. So along the lines of resources, is there any tools or technologies that you use that help you to track diversity and inclusion data?
Yeah, well, I would say for organizations that are just starting out, or I say just starting out, but your initial diversity and inclusion, you have to gather some data. Culture Amp is a great survey tool, great company. You can do your own survey. There are plenty of diversity and inclusion consultants, and we can link to a few after this podcast that can do those surveys for you and analyze them. Tableau, getting Tableau built into your system. Workday has that ability as well. I'm trying to think if there are any others off the top of my head. I feel like those are really good to start. And another vendor that is very new, but and I'm just starting to work with them, but I have really high hopes because they're data focused, is a company called Escalera. They're out of San Francisco, and they're actually trying to measure inclusion. And I think that is a really interesting cutting edge place to go. Yeah. How included do you feel? And it's interesting that you say that this is all just, basic human behavior, right? Everything I ever needed to learn, I learned in kindergarten, right? Treat others how you want to be treated. But I think what tends to happen, especially in times where we're polarized, is we lean really heavily on our own biases, and we don't even know that we're doing it. It doesn't make us bad people, but you have to have a cognizance. That's really what the inclusive leadership training teaches you, is cognizance of your own biases. Like why don't I think that George, who's 65, can do this, right? Oh, it's because I think he's too old to learn this new technology. Have I asked him? Have I, checked in on his comfort zone? Things like that. And I remember in one of the trainings I did, an older woman was at a tech firm, which is unusual, right? Like the average age is like well under 30. And she was probably close to 60 years old. And she said that what people don't realize is that I've been using computers longer than all of you have been alive. And it just cracked us all up, but it was the truth, right? She's seen every iteration of computers. And that's why it's important to get comfortable with your team and build a real sense of psychological safety and trust. And my biggest piece of advice in terms of if you really want to make changes, yes, look at your demographic data. Really encourage people to identify and self-identify. also do a culture amp or some sort of survey that's trying to measure the culture and the feeling of belonging people have in your organization. Look at your attrition rates, look at your promotion rates, and then also, frankly, train your leaders to be really, really inclusive so that you can create that environment. It's both the data and the human. They have to come together in order for a real change to happen. And the final thing I'd say is that it's a very individualized journey, right? You have to be willing to go to the places of asking, why do I think that people of a different generation don't understand me?
Yeah.
Right? Or I don't understand them. Why do I think, why haven't I promoted anyone of color in my office, right? Why have I not promoted anyone who's ever been Black or African American, right? And asking yourself those hard questions. And sometimes it's really a dark place for people to go to, especially in business, but it's incredibly important to get to the other side, because then you have what I call your heart moments, right? The data is like living in your head, but the real change happens at the humanity level.
Yeah. Wow. That's powerful. This is good stuff, Elaine.
Thank you, Ms. Kalia.
I love this. This is really good. So, I mean, one of the concepts that we talked about, and you're touching on it a little bit just now, but we talked about when we had our prep call, was that like diversity is almost seen as like a dirty word.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So totally. I always say that. I was like, the dirty secret of diversity is that it's difficult. And the way I like to say it is this, right? You and I are about the same age and we have very similar interests. And frankly, our friend circle looks about the same as well, right? Yeah. And so when I go to all of you and I say, isn't this idea a great idea? Most of the time you're going to say, yes, it's awesome. Of course I want to drink wine and yoga at the same time, right? Yeah. Like I have figured it out, the yoga bar, right? But you need someone from different backgrounds to say, you know what, maybe it's not a good idea to serve mom wine and then have them get in the carpool lane, right? Yeah. Like you need someone to poke holes in your ways of thinking, and the poking holes is actually where dissent happens, and the dissension gets you to the better product. And I know I'm giving like a very joking example, but I'll give a better one, right? When Apple came out with their health app, right? And it was this great revolutionary tool. You could measure your steps and your exercise and all these different factors, but they didn't have anything to measure a woman's menstrual cycle, right? Which as women, we understand that like impacts our daily lives, right? And that's because they don't have very many women working on their engineering and product teams. So there was no one in the room to be like, oh, we're missing a whole facet here. Yeah. And what would have happened had women been a part of that process or had a large enough voice in that process is they would have come out with an app that really worked for everyone, not just a subset of people, right? However, when you create that dissension in a room, well, sometimes it usually makes the product launch longer. It's more expensive. It's less easy, right? Everybody wants to have a yes man or woman team to get their thing launched, especially in the tech world where you're moving so fast, right? But in reality, the diversity and the dissension gets you the better product. And that is why that's why it impacts innovation. Because you have different people in the room. And just imagine if people with disabilities or veterans had been in the room, right? What if that app had been able to measure some aspect for veterans to check in on their mental health, right? Coming back from war, right? So that's why it's important to have the room filled with people that have different backgrounds.
Yeah, this is all so great. I mean, and I know as we wrap up here, I feel like having the voice in the conversation, while of course it makes sense for us on the human to human basis, and you've done a fantastic job of articulating why and helping us like see that we're just working against something we don't even know. And it's time for us all to dig a little deeper into that. But at the end of the day, a diverse team is a more effective team. It's a more lucrative team for the company as well.
Absolutely. Well, and that's why the leadership is so important, because while I say diversity creates dissent, a really good leader will cultivate that dissent and get the team to a really safe psychological safety place where they can feel free to dissent. And it's not this big setback any longer. Instead, it's like, oh, we've dissented. Now we're going to get to the better idea faster. It's only dissension when the leader has not cultivated the psychological safety for the team to thrive.
Wow. That's the name of your book, Elaine, Cultivating Dissent.
Ooh,
I love it.
Kaylee, I love it. Done.
Thank you so much for your time today, Elaine. This is a fantastic conversation. I feel like, personally, I think it's hard work to do. Like you said, you got to get to the root of these issues, and you're probably going to unpack and uncover some stuff you probably have been pushing aside. But once you're on the other side of it, you never go back. Right?
You never go back.
This is getting woke, right?
It is. I was about to say it's the getting woke part, right? And I will say, for anyone that feels like, oh, I'm really woke, we read White Fragility and and keep going, right? Like it's never ending and it's ongoing. And also it's Black History Month. So I'd like to encourage everyone to read a Black author, get outside your comfort zone, watch some podcasts, follow some Black leaders, learn some history. It's really, really important for all of us to kind of just lean into it, so to speak.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time today, Elaine. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kalia. I appreciate it as well.